pick up right where we left off last time. This is what we had derived, basically, right? Was, and I'm just switching. I noticed in some of the notes I use capital letters. Sometimes I use lowercase letters, so I'm just going to mix it up. So you should get comfortable with that. If we have our standard first-order linear system with A, B, C, and D all real numbers, so the coefficients are real numbers, and we use some complex arithmetic to derive something still about reals. So we define G of omega. Omega is a real variable, a real frequency, and it's just this rational, this expression that involves C, B, A, and omega, n squared to the minus 1. Then we finally have the following claim. If U is a sine wave input, maybe with a factor of 2 in front of it, or a factor of -3 in front of it, but a sine wave input, then Y will go to a sine wave. Well, Y will equal a sine wave at same exact frequency. And I forgot one thing here. Sorry. Bar. So same frequency though. It's not. It has a different magnitude. This had a magnitude of U bar. This has a magnitude of G times U bar. That's the new magnitude. And it's shifted by this angle of this complex number. So the magnitude and angle of this complex number turn out to play a role in this. But then there's another term that came when you did the integration that had an e to the at in front of it, and then some constant here that depended on U bar and omega. It was written down in the notes. The key is if A is negative, right? If A is less than 0, then this decays to 0, with the time constant that we're familiar with. So if A, then this decays to 0. So kind of you can kind of forget about that, and this becomes the steady state behavior of Y. Okay? So you put in a sine at a certain amplitude, you get out a sine at the same amplitude, except it's actually been not the same amplitude, it's been either attenuated or amplified by this amount, and the same frequency, but it's shifted. Now someone came up to me after class, and one thing, I don't know that this was exactly their question, but this certainly came out of the discussion. And we did this through a fairly circuitous route involving complex exponentials. But in the end, there's nothing complex about the input and nothing complex about the output. It's a sine, and what comes out is a sine. So this tells us how the system responds to sine waves. But I think one of the questions was, well, what if I had just written down, x of t is e to the at x0 plus the integral from 0 to t, e to the a t minus tau. Let's put a b in here, and then let's put a u bar sine of omega tau. Let's do it without the complex arithmetic. Let's just plug that in directly, and then let's remember that y of t is simply whatever comes out of this plus d times, again, this u bar sine of omega tau at t, right? That's what u of t is. So you could just go through and do this integral, right? You just have to do it by parts twice, or look it up in a book, but there's obviously an exponential and a sine. And you'll get exactly the same formula. You'll get exactly the same formulas. But what'll happen is the g of omega, the magnitude, you'll have this big expression in front of here, which turns out it is g of omega, the magnitude. But it'll just be a messy expression involving d, a, b, c, and omega. It'll be exactly what that would do if I wrote out the magnitude of that. It's pretty messy. And then you'll get this sine of omega t, you should get u bar, and you'll get omega t plus, again, some messy expression. And what's not clear is that, so this is, it'll be a messy expression, but it will turn out to be the angle of g of omega. What's not clear if you do it this way is that this is the magnitude of some complex number that depends on frequency, and this is the angle of that same complex number. So you would just get two heinous expressions, and they would be there. What you wouldn't notice is that they're tied together by this simple expression, and one of them is the magnitude and one of them is the angle. So you can get this any number of ways, but it's hard to recognize that it has this simple form when you do it this way. That's one claim for why we did it this way. Okay, but in any case, so we now know how the system responds to sine waves if you ignore this decaying aspect. And so that was one of the things that you were looking at in the MATLAB code that we had. I guess let me pop it up. You're going to probably want to use the same code in your homework. Put it back. I think I got it right here. Where was it? Let's see. Maybe in M files. FRF examples. So let's go to a different example. Here was one that I don't think I got to, but let's. I just made up some data. A, B, C, D. There they are. A is -1, B is 1, C is 1, D is -0.75. It is what it is. This is the magnitude of G right here. From frequency, this is the frequency variable, frequency omega. So it starts at a small number at low frequency, and it eventually becomes a large number. So we picked up two frequencies, 1 and 5, those are here, and then we've done the actual sine response. Let's see that these are consistent. So at frequency 1, the magnitude is about 0.55. So that means if we put a sine wave in of magnitude 1, the red, we should eventually get out a sine wave of magnitude about 0.55. And you see that's what's happening here. It's cut off a little bit of the legend, but you see that's at -0.55 and this one's at 0.55. So it's converged. How quickly should it take to get there? Well, remember this term that's here, it's decaying with the time constant. In this case, A was -1, so the time constant is 1 unit. So this term, however big it is, after 3 time units, 3 time constants, we know it's only about 1/20th of what it was. So it's decaying with the time constant. Sure enough, after about, it looks like after, certainly after 4 time constants, this is starting to look like this sine, whereas initially you see it was completely not right. So in the beginning, the first couple of seconds here, or first couple of time units, it's not right, but then it's settled down to this sine wave. Let's check and make sure that the shift is right. So the angle here is -2 radians. Remember how we're supposed to interpret that from your homework. We take this, so if I look at this, I'm going to write this out. I don't know if you did it in the homework this way, but if I write omega t plus phi, so I can write that as omega t plus phi over omega. And I can write that as omega t plus phi over 2 pi times 2 pi over omega. So the time shift, that's a period. So this is telling me the fraction of the period that is time shifted by, right? Because I have t, this is clearly a time shift, just elementary functions, right? If you shift the variable, time shift. And I've written it now as a fraction times the period. So phi was -2. -2 over 2 pi is about 1/3. So we should be about 1/3 of a period, in this case, behind. And let's see what's happening here. Let's see, where am I here? Yep. And so that's happening, right? The red is the forcing function. And look what's happening when it finally settles in. The dotted one is about 1/3 of a period behind. The period is, we can kind of eyeball what the period is. It's about that distance from 4 to 9, about 6. And sure enough, that's about 2 units behind. So it is about 1/3 of a period behind, which is what we expected from this. Does everybody understand that? So that's consistent. We go down to here, go to the higher frequency one, the magnitude's 0.7 something. And sure enough, this higher frequency thing, the thing is settled to about 0.7 as expected. And the phase shift should be more like -3 over 2 pi. So about a half of a period. And if you look at that, you can see they're just completely out of phase with each other. When one is going up, the other one's going down. So they are a half a period out. Yeah.
So it looks like it kind of grows out to that 0.55 amplitude. So is that just depending on your initial condition?
Yeah, it depends on the initial condition. It depends on this term that we're just not studying it. We can look at this more carefully and see that that's exactly why it's, in one case it's growing out. This one, well, the top one, you can see it just clearer because there's a lot more resolution there. But it clearly starts and it doesn't immediately take on that sign at 0.55, or the negative 0.55. So we're not talking right now about how to, like if I gave you this, could you just quickly draw this magnitude? Can you draw that that's the magnitude and that's the phase? We're not talking about that. We will get better at that by doing it by hand, just immediately knowing what it's going to approximately look like. For now, we're just plotting with MATLAB and checking. We'll just quickly, I won't go through the same details, but let's just look at one more. Okay, so here I just, it's just different data. We get different magnitude, different angles, and let's just look at this. The magnitude is about 1.1, and it looks like the dashed black line is actually a little bigger than the red line once it settles in. It is larger than the input. The phase is, this angle is negative 0.5, so negative 0.5 over 2 pi, so negative 0.5 over 12 and a half, 1/25th. It should only be about 1/25th of a period behind. And sure enough, the black one, maybe, no, 2 pi is almost 6. Sorry, doubling myself twice. So it should only be about a 12th of a period behind, and that's what it looks like it is. It's a little bit behind, and perfect. Over here, next one, so on. You can do the same thing. You can kind of see the black there. Also very much, it's even more aligned with it. It's only about a 10th of a period, no, even less than that. And anyway, they certainly look quite a bit lined up. So you can go through all these, and it's just what you want to, if you've never done this before, you want to just grasp that everything he said, he meaning me, is right. This number captures how much it's going to change the sine wave input, modulo the fact that there's a little bit of transient in the beginning. But this number, its magnitude and its angle tell us what it does to sine waves. So if we plot that, we now know, before we knew what it did to no inputs, when we just had exponential decay, we knew what it did to constant inputs, and now we know what it does to sine inputs, sine and cosines. And an arbitrary input is, of course, none of those. It's something different. But hopefully understanding what it does to those types of inputs allows us to make an educated guess as to what it's going to do to general inputs. Make sense? So we just want to understand these exact solutions viscerally. You want to understand, you want to understand it like you don't remember when you didn't understand it. So that's how we got to get to it. Okay, so let's switch gears. We have to do one more mathematical thing, and then we will be able to start talking about feedback systems. And so this is a short set of slides, and it's 5 slides, I think, or 4 slides, and then we'll be able to dig into applying everything we've just done, which was our complete study of single differential equation first order systems, and we'll apply them to these feedback systems that you've been playing with for the last couple weeks. So what I want to do now is what's called a delay differential equation. So normally in our differential equations we've written down, the argument, there was an argument, all the signals had arguments, right? T, 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 T. They always were at the same T. So we're going to once in a while consider a situation where one of the arguments has a delayed time. So the value of x dot, I don't know if this thing seems to be fading on me, you can see the back. But the value of x dot at time little t depends on the value at time t, but it also depends on an old value of x. Okay, so we want to understand how a differential equation like that behaves in the presence of this, what we're calling a time delay, capital T. And what we're going to see is that capital T, depending on how things work, can make things not work right. I think I made the analogy to speaking on the phone. And if there's a delay on the phone, conversation kind of gets in this weird oscillation where you're both talking on each other or no one's talking. And it's this constant thing, and finally you just figure out you've got to do it some other way. But everyone's confused about the delay. They weren't anticipating it, and their strategy wasn't ready for it. The other example I use is, so it's not really, we're just going to do the math right now. We're not going to talk about feedback yet. But here's an example how delays especially if you don't know that they're there, how they can really hurt you. Suppose you're taking a shower at home. You're used to that shower. You know exactly, you turn, it's a little bit cold, you want to make it a little warmer, you're already in, you turn a little bit, you just wait. It takes a few seconds for you to feel it in your shower because of the way, however the pipes are configured. But now you go to a hotel or a friend's house or whatever, and you're in the shower, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, I do want to make it a little warmer or a little colder. And you don't really know, you're not sure, you turn a little bit, and you wait a second until nothing happens. So you're not sure, like, should I just wait a little more? Or is the valve just kind of crusty and nothing's actually happened yet? And so that time delay makes you know there's a time delay, and you're not sure what it is, because it's not the system you've been playing with kind of every day. So you're obviously very ginger about that. A lot of times in the shower, it's even worse than that. You don't even know which direction, because it's not marked very well. So you're not even sure which way is hot and which way is cold, right? So you have a sign, you don't even know the sign of something. There's a gain, and you're not sure what it is. So that makes you also, as a controller, you're very, what's the right word? You're very tentative. But go back to your room. You're at your apartment. You know how it works, totally fine. And you've gotten to where you can get, because of your sensory system, you can get the temperature exactly what you want it to be, no problem. Even with this crusty valve and just the hot and water cold supply, which temperatures are different every day, but they're, it's colder than you want. The cold is colder than you want it, the hot's hotter than you want it. So you can dial in perfectly as a feedback controller. Now suppose if you look behind the wall, right, somehow the pipes are coming up, and there's, the valve, here's the knob you're turning, and somehow that's mixing the thing, and then it goes like this, right, and there's the shower head. Okay. So that's the delay, right? The delay is that when you turn it here, the water's still got to go up here and come out. That's why it takes whatever it takes before you feel it. So suppose your roommates, they're crafty, and they've noticed that you can get access to these pipes from a closet, and one of them just learned how to weld or solder or whatever, braze. So they put about 6 extra feet of coil in there. Okay? So now so that's a delay you didn't know was there. And think exactly how this is going to work. You're going to get in, and you're going to take a shower, and it's like, oh, it's fine. I like it a little warmer, just a speck warmer. So then you turn it, and you wait your 1 second, and nothing happened, because there's a long delay here, right? And you weren't counting on that. So then you, oh, okay, a little crusty, or someone took a long shower before me, and I've lost the hot water. So I turn it a little more, still nothing happens. I turn it a little more, still nothing happens. Finally, it's like, perfect, now it's coming. But then it starts getting too hot, right? Because you've already turned it 6 times as far as you should have. So then you start turning it back, but what happens, it gets hotter. As you turn it colder, it still keeps getting hotter because of that delay. There's all that hot water in the pipes, right? And so you get into this oscillation. And finally you realize, I would have been better just leaving it how it was. It was actually not too bad when I tried to make it a little warmer, right? So feedback in this case hurt you. You wouldn't have been better off just dealing with the fact that you were off a little bit. So delays can clearly cause problems, right? That's pretty obvious. Maybe, yeah. So try it. But okay, so now we just went now to this slide is just the mathematics of it for this system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that if capital T, this is really bad. Let me see if I take the battery out real quick. If capital T were 0, so if there was no delay, no, it's no better. If there was no delay, it would just be A1 plus A2 times x of t. So let's assume that it's stable if t is 0. So I'm going to assume that sum is negative. A1 plus A2 is negative. That's the same as saying if there was no time delay, it would be 0. Now, if there's a time delay, think about the initial condition. This is telling me that x dot at time t depends on x at time t as well as x capital T seconds ago. And then a little while later, x at t plus epsilon, little t plus epsilon, depends on x dot depends on that and capital T seconds ago. So the initial condition is no longer a point, one value. It's the whole value of x before you start this thing. So from 0 back to negative t. So the initial condition is now an initial function. It's what's kind of stored in the delay from negative t to 0, and then we'll start the thing, and then it will, of course, evolve. So the initial condition is not adequate concept for delayed differential equations. You need this initial function. So then what happens is, at some non-zero but fixed positive value of t, the system may be unstable. And by that I just mean that if you just let it go from some initial state, it will not decay to 0. It will tend to either persist or blow up. So at some value of t, it might become unstable. And the fact is, and this is something we can't prove in this class, we can observe it, and I'll bring up a MATLAB to see it. It turns out that if the system is unstable for some t, then at the smallest value of t for which that happens, so t equals 0, it's stable. T equals 1 nanosecond, it's still stable. T equals a millisecond, it's still stable. But you march out, finally at t equals 1.3 seconds, it's unstable. What will happen is the way in which it will become unstable is purely sinusoidal functions will exist. Will solve the equation. Purely they don't decay to 0, but the way in which they don't decay to 0 is they're purely sinusoidal. So that's harder to show. We don't know what frequency it'll happen at, but we want to figure that out. We want to understand at what value of t do the non-decaying solutions start to exist. What we're told is that the way in which they'll be non-decaying is they'll be perfectly sinusoidal, and that's enough information for us to set up the equations and solve this. So let me show you an example first, I guess. Here it is, delay example. So let's just run this thing, publish it. So I've got a bunch of simple examples, and I think it's still coming up actually. Yeah. Okay, so I got, there's some code I wrote for you called ODE45 delay. And we'll look later how I wrote that. I just call ODE45 in a nice sequence. So now if I give you the initial condition, which is an initial function, right, from 0 back to negative t. So then that becomes a forcing function for the differential equation from 0 to t, right? Because during this time period, old values matter. So then you can call ODE45, treating that as a forcing function, and you solve for this chunk, and then you just march out. So in any case, there's a way to solve these things. And what we did is I just simply took an equation. Here's the code. Here's the equation. X of t minus 6x of t minus t plus a forcing function. So my initial condition is going to be completely 0. And my forcing function is just going to be, I guess it's at the top, it's just going to be a little pulse. For 1/10 of a second, I'm just going to apply a 5. So it's just going to take this system, which is completely at rest, and we're just going to bump it for 1/10 of a second, and then we're going to shut the input off, and we're going to see what happens. So, and you can see that I have my A1 is positive 1, and my A2 is negative 6. So -1 plus negative, or 1 plus negative 6 is negative 5. This is stable if t is equal to 0. Let's see what happens when we simulate it for small but growing values of t. So when we do this, we simulate it for 9 values of t. Now there's one of them right there, the 0.23721, which I clearly picked. And if you look at this, you can see that. Sorry, I'm having trouble here. There it is. So at 0.01, it's stable. And remember, why is it jumping up? Because we're pushing it with a large input for 1/10 of a second. 0.05, the delay starts coming in here. You start to see a little bit of oscillation that we talked about. More oscillation, and there it is, perfectly sinusoidal at that value. And then beyond that, it actually becomes exponentially growing. So what we're seeing here is just a visual evidence of what I claimed was true. At the smallest value of t for which it goes unstable, it becomes perfectly sinusoidal at some frequency. I did another example, and there's another one in here, same thing. Okay, so if we believe that, which we're going to just take it as given, then it's just a matter of finding this out. If I give you A1 and A2, can you find the t and the omega? And let's see how we do that. So we're going to use complex arithmetic. Again, you wouldn't have to use complex arithmetic if you do this straight with sines and cosines. But what we said was that what we really want to do is we want to find the smallest value of t. Sorry, smallest value of t, capital T, such that, and in a frequency, omega, such that this, which is a complex sine wave, that's cosines and sines, is a solution to this differential equation. Right? So what we saw is if capital T is too small, that won't be a solution. But at some critical value of capital T, that will be a solution. And we can figure out what the omega is. Okay, so let's just plug it in. We don't know what either of these are, omega or T, but this is what we want to do. We want to match up the derivative of x should be a1 times x plus a2 times this old value x. And that should be true for all t. We want it to be a solution, solving the differential equation. Okay, so I can divide by e to the j omega t. It's in every one of these terms, and that's never equal to 0, right? That's a phasor. So if I divide by that, what I get is I get j omega, I have a1, and then what's left here is just a2 e to the negative j omega cap t. So this is the equation you want to solve. You're given a1 and a2, and you want to find an omega and a capital T such that that works. Now, how many equations is this in terms of real equations? It's a complex valued equation, so how many equations is it really? 2, right? There's a real part and an imaginary part. So I could write this like this. Well, maybe I'd do that on the next slide, right? So it makes sense, first of all, that you can solve this because there's 2 real parameters you're looking for, omega and t, and this really is 2 equations. This plus the real part of this has to add up to 0, and the imaginary part of this has to add up, this plus the, let's see, hang on, now I'm confused. Yeah, so the imaginary part of that has to be j omega. So it is 2 equations and 2 unknowns. It makes sense you can solve them. It's a little bit of a nonlinear equation. You got omega t multiplying each other in an exponential. So maybe there's a clever geometrical way to solve this. So if we write it out as equating the real and imaginary parts, I get exactly what I had on the previous page, right? That's just taking that equation. So clearly, if I square them and add them up, right, I'm going to get. So I have to think about. Yeah, if I square these, I guess I move the. Why am I not seeing this now? A1 squared equals. So I guess if I square the first equation, I'm going to get a1 squared equals a2 squared cosine squared, right? And the bottom equation says a2 sine squared equals omega squared. So when I add this, I get a2 squared equals a1 squared plus omega squared. So a2 squared equals a1 squared plus omega squared. Clearly, the only way that's going to work is if a2 in absolute value is bigger than or equal to a1. That's the only way it has a solution, because omega squared is always going to be a non-negative number. So, first of all, if a2 is less than a1, there's no problem. This cannot be a solution. So if we had a system that looked like this, x dot equals negative 5x a2 plus a t plus 3x of t minus t. So that's one where a2 is, first of all, a1 plus a2 is negative, so it's stable with no time delay, and a2 is smaller than a1, so there's not going to be no problem. That'll never go unstable. But in general, if a2 is bigger than a1, so the example that I threw up there, which was more like this, okay, 1 and negative 6, that one now we're in business. We can maybe get a solution. So I can solve for omega. Right there I get omega. It's a real non-negative number. Now what I want to do is I want to try to solve the remaining things. So I'm going to call omega t. Now I know what omega is. I don't know what t is. So another way of saying that is I don't know what theta is. Right? It's the same thing. Once I solve for theta, I can solve for t. So I want to find, by finding the smallest t that works, I'm really finding the smallest theta that works. And if you simply treat omega t as theta, and you move those things over and divide, you see that the cosine of theta has to be negative a1 over a2, and the sine of theta has to be negative omega over a2. So I know this, I know this, I know this, and I know this. So I'm simply trying to find the smallest positive theta, non-negative theta. We're not going to go for, we don't want to go for negative values of t. We only want to go for positive values of t. So therefore, we only have to go for positive values of theta. Okay. So what does the picture look like? The assumption was A1 plus A2 is negative. We don't even start the problem if that's not the case. Then we saw that the only interesting thing is when A2 is greater than A1 in absolute value. And then we can solve for this, and we get that theta has to be this arctan 2, right? This is where we take into account the sine component and the cosine component separately to make sure we get the sines right. And this is what we'll get as the value for theta, and then t, of course, is just theta divided by the omega that we solve for. So there's a 4-line MATLAB program that does this, right? You solve for omega, then you call A tan 2, and then you solve for t, and you do this only if A2 is bigger than or equal to A1. And so we can try these two cases out, right? And there'll be different solutions. There they are, what theta we're looking for. And that's measuring theta positive coming all the way around here. So I'll let you work through those. Let me show you the code though. So the code is right. Delay margin calc. So I put this is posted for you. So we give it A1 and A2. And I check and see if the absolute value, if it's less than 0, fine. Otherwise we'll print an error that says system is not stable at t equals 0. If it's greater than like we're supposed to, we calculate omega, we calculate the arctan 2, and we calculate the time delay. Otherwise, if that if statement is not true, we know we're stable for all positive t, so we'll return an infinity for this time delay margin, and no frequency causes a problem. So that's the code, very simple to use. And that's all I want to say about time delays for now. Is there any questions? I'm not yet.
Can you explain how it's got omega equals the square root of
Yeah. So I'll just say this again. So what we had, the two equations were, let me go back. Okay, so this equation is A1 equals negative A2 cosine. And negative A2 sine equals omega. That's the bottom equation. So square these. When I square this and add them, I get A2 squared. The cosine squared, the sine squared add up to give me that. So when I square this, I get A1 squared plus omega squared equals A2 squared, right? A1 squared plus omega squared equals A2 squared. That's the key to figuring out omega. That's the only omega that there can be. And obviously that means this has to be larger than or equal to this, otherwise there will be no solution. Once you get that, then it's a matter of a little trigonometry. The only reason why the trigonometry is a little bit tricky is because we're only looking for a positive value of t, therefore we're only looking for a positive value of theta. So the theta, depending on what quadrant you're in, it may look like, oh, theta was just negative 30 degrees. No, it's positive 330 degrees. You got to get the right sign on theta. It's not a negative number. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah.
For the relation of the delay to the instability, is it always
delay to the what? Sorry.
Instability.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it always that like up to some t it's stable, and then at some point it's unstable? Always after that?
No, it's interesting. You can. I don't know. You can make up systems where. This mathematically, I'm trying to think if I know of any examples of. I do know of some, but where it's stable, then you take time delay long enough, it's unstable, and then take time delay long enough again, and it becomes stable. So we're not figuring any of that out. We're only figuring out that first onset of instability. But there are situations where it can happen again. So in that case, we're not learning how to do that, and we're not going to. Let me look into it a little more and try to give you a good example. Okay? All right. So I showed you the code. It's all there for you to download. Please take a look at these examples that I made up in this MATLAB file. This one, it's delay example and delay more examples. And we'll talk a little bit later about how I did ODE 45 delay. You can look through that code and also see how that works if you want to. It's just, if you look carefully in it, you'll see there's a for loop, or I guess it's a while loop probably. It's a for loop, and I'm calling ODE 45, and I built up some function handles and so on. So in Simulink, you just go to, I forget what block it is, what library it is, but there's a delay block in Simulink. I think it's called transport delay. It's called transport delay because of my example. Remember my example with the shower, right? The reason why there's a delay from doing something here to there is because literally material has to be transported, right? So it's called, in Simulink, it's called a transport delay. And if you look through the help, you'll find what library that's in. And then you can drag out a delay block and delay one signal from the other. And you'll see that the output is just a delayed instance, a delayed version of the input. And if you put it in a long enough delay, you'll screw up the simulations that you've been playing with so far. Okay. Any other questions on that? So now what I want to do is I want to find the slides where I think that the best question would be, or a legitimate question is, okay, are we ever going to get back to feedback systems? So let's do that right now. How are we going to put all these tools that we've just learned to apply it to, like, even just this simple cruise control? So I've got a couple things like this. I don't know, we got 13 minutes. I don't know how far we'll get through this, but this is not too hard. So this is just simple arithmetic. So let's do what we've done. Let's take since we only can handle right now one differential equation, I can't have like a differential equation both in my controller and in my process. I can have it in one place and not the other because we built up the math for one differential equation. So let's do this first case where the differential equation is in the process. So the process is our standard x dot is some ax plus b1 times the disturbance plus b2 times the control. I don't know why I'm even using this, okay? So that's the first thing. And then y will just be some c times x. So the output is just some consequence of the state. So we just have our, it's very much like our rocket. Theta dot was theta plus u minus d, y was theta. So that would be handled by this equation. And then the controller, since we can't afford a differential equation in there yet, mathematically, the controller will just be this prop, I think we call it prop 2D, proportional, but with two different numbers. So u coming out of the controller will be some number k times r. That's part of our strategy. We just take whatever r is and we multiply it by 3.7 minus some other k times what we're measuring. So some other number. So the controller is parameterized by two numbers in this formula. That's the corrective strategy. Look at what you want, look at what you're getting, combine them, and spit that out as the u to the process. So now what we have to do is we just have to, in Simulink we know we would never try to plug one into the other. Simulink just went around the block, went around the diagram, asking each person what's their derivatives and so on. We want to analyze this whole thing analytically, so we're going to now substitute one for the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute this right into there. So that's going to give me x dot is ax plus b1d. So there's ax plus b1d. Now I've got b2u. b2, or u is kffr, so I must get a b2 kffr, b2 kffr. Then I have minus b2 kfb ym. So, but ym is just y plus noise. So I must get a minus b2 kfb noise, minus b2 kfb noise. And then the other thing is the y part. So that's going to be b2 kfb times c times x. b2 kfb times c times x with a minus because of that minus. So simply plug u into there and remember what ym is. Ym is y plus n. And remember that y is cx. So now I've got exactly how x behaves. It's driven by three things. It's driven by r, d, and n. R, d, and n, there's x inside here. What are the two variables that I care about usually? I usually care about the output of the process, because that's the thing I was trying to regulate. So what is that? Well, that's just c times x. Nothing times r, nothing times d, nothing times n. It's c times x. And the other variable I'm often interested is the variable that's doing all the correcting. I'd like to see how it's doing the corrections. So I have to plug in what u is. Now u, I'm not allowed to write this. I can only write u in terms of x and r, d, and n. So sure enough, I plug in for y again. That's y, that's cx plus n. So I'm going to get kffr minus KFBCX, because of the CX that's in there, and then minus KFBN, and nothing times the disturbance. So this is what I'll call the closed loop state equations. These are the differential equations and output equations governing the closed loop. From the closed loop system's point of view, I've got 3 inputs and 2 outputs, and I've got 1 state variable. There's how the state variable evolves as a function of these 3 inputs, and here are the 2 outputs that I'm interested in evolve as a consequence of X's evolution as well as the inputs, the forcing functions.
Professor?
Yes?
Can you explain again how you get that first parentheses multiplying the xt and the x dot? So the
This one? This one?
No, in the bottom box.
This one, okay, yeah. So let's see, I mean, I got an AX, right? That's where the A comes from. Then I got B2U. But U has in it. So let's see what U is. U is KFFR minus KFBY, right? But Y is CX plus N. So that's what U is. So now I'm going to multiply this times B2, put that whole thing times B2, right? Because I got a B2U. And you see, one of the things I'm going to get is I am going to get a B2 KFBCX.
Okay.
So that's where the B2 KFBCX came from. So this is you just, if you get a piece of paper out, you'll just write this out. It'll take 4 minutes to write it out if you don't see it. Yeah. Yeah, remember in the simulation, in some of those files you played with, when you did prop 2D, that I gave you the code for, I think one of them was that just U was like 4 times R minus 5 times Y measured. So that's those. So back then, someone said, where do you come up with those numbers? I said, well, we'll see where I came up with them. That's what the whole course is about. It's how we're going to come up with those numbers. So first we have to be able to analyze differential equations. Now we got differential equations that have a couple of things that we can adjust. I can adjust this. The problem is if I adjust this, it also changes there, it changes there, and it changes there. And I can also adjust this, but that's in several places. So I got to figure out, what am I going to do with these 2 degrees of freedom that I have in order to make the system behave the way I want it to behave. So now we got to figure out is how does this thing behave, and why would we set KFB to be, for instance, 4 or so on, positive 5 in this case, right? The minus signs built in the formula. So let's look at this. But that's how the system behaves, right? That's the closed loop system. So first of all, how do I determine the stability of this? What's going to determine the stability of this system? This thing, right? Does that have to be positive or negative? Negative. What's going to determine the time constant of this system? Again, exactly that. So the things we're going to be interested in are going to be stability. Then once we've got stability, maybe the time constant matters. Then we're also going to be interested in, how D affects Y. We want the disturbance to not have much effect on Y. So we might look at this steady state gain, maybe the steady state gain from D to Y. Or we might look at the frequency response function from D to Y. How do sine waves at certain frequencies map their way over to Y? We also want to look at the R to Y. We'd like the steady state gain from R to Y to be 1. I want to know if I put in 55, I get out 55 if there are no disturbances. And then I want to also look at how N affects things. So what we want to do is start studying, each of these things in isolation. Remember how we talked about early on, if I had several inputs, so now I'm backing up to just the abstract setting. X dot equals AX plus B1 U1 plus B2 U2, right? 2 separate inputs. Well, we saw that, right, the effect of these together is really just the additive separate effect. We can look separately how U1 affects X, and then how U2 affects X, and the way in which their combination affects it is just the sum. So we really can treat these things as separately. I can try to understand how R affects Y, and how R affects U, how D affects Y, and how D affects U, and how N affects Y, and how N affects U. They're all coupled together because there's only 2 free parameters. So when I change either one of the K's, several things are going to change in concert. But I can look at these 6 basically separate things. The influence of these 3 inputs on those 2 outputs. And we'll look at them separately because they're eventually just additive. We talked about that in some detail before. So here I've just rewritten the thing again. Everything on the top is exactly the same. Then I rewrote it in matrix form here. So x dot is that times x, that times r, that times d, that times n. Y is that, and so on. There's a lot of zeros in certain places. Suppose I was only interested in how d affected y. So if I'm only interested in how d affects y, I can forget about r and n. That's my point. So I can forget about r and forget about n. Right? Now I've got how d affects u and y, and then I don't care about u. So I can also cross out the bottom thing. So if I was looking at, if I asked you, how does d affect y, you would go and pick off this. That's the a value, that's the b value, that's the c value, that's the d value. Does everybody see that? That's how d affects y. So I can go into anywhere in this thing and find my little 2 by 2 matrix. How does n affect u? How does n affect u? Okay, I don't care about r and d. I don't care about y. So n affects u. It's those four numbers. A, B, C, D. People see that? We're always looking for that A, B, C, D quadruple. The state derivative in terms of the state plus something acting as the b times the input, and then whatever output we're interested in, the something times the state, and then whatever number here, the something times the input. So we can go through individually one at a time and pick things off. So for instance, so I guess we already talked about stability. Stability is going to be true if and only if a minus b2 kfbc is less than 0, because that's precisely the closed loop a. So we need to pick kfb to make that negative if it wasn't already negative. And then the time constant is just the negative reciprocal of that. So what this tells me, if I want to make the time constant very small, I probably have to pick kfb very big. And that'll make this fraction become smaller and smaller and smaller. Now I can look at the frequency response functions. So let's go back and we'll do n to y, let's do a different one. Well, okay. What is the frequency response function in general? Let me remind you again. It was, remember what it was? It was, if we had an A, B, C, D, I'll write it in matrix form. Just like this, generic letters, right? XU. So x dot is AX plus BU, Y is CX plus DU. The frequency response function was this, right? So, in this case, I've got A, I'll write it like this, BR, BD, BN, CY, CU, DYR, DYD, DYN, DUR, DUD, DUN. Does everybody see? That's what we have now. X dot YU, and over here I have X, R, D, and N. And you can see I can pick off whatever input and output I'm interested in, I just pick them off. So if I'm interested in D to Y, I'm going to save this. Nope, I'm going to save this and this. That's D to Y. So I'm going to form, that's exactly what I formed here. I've just plugged in everything. You can see the j omega minus A. In this case, there was no D. This was a 0. And then BD was exactly that. So I have the frequency response functions as functions of the parameters. You can see KFF enters in some places, KFB enters in some places. We can look at the steady state gains. Let's look at those. Steady state gain, truly steady state, not sinusoidal steady state. What do I set omega equal to? What sine wave is constant? Omega equal 0, right? That's why this becomes at omega equals 0, you just get, negative b over a or negative cb over a, just like we were used to. So here I've set those. And so now you can get a sense of what you might want to do. You might want to pick KFB to make the steady state gain from d to y maybe smaller than some number. You want to make sure that a constant disturbance, I want it to have not much effect on y, so I can pick KFB to make this small enough. Once KFB is chosen, what would I pick KFF to make the steady state gain from r to y equal to? 1, for instance. Then we know I'll get perfect tracking because no disturbance. So there's one way in which you could choose things. Pick this to get the disturbance attenuation what you want, and then pick that to get the r to y to be what we want. We'll play with these. I got lots of simulation examples posted for you, and we'll pick up with this next time. Yeah.